Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Cradle News Roundup, your one-stop shop for all news West Asia. My name is Esteban Carrillo. I am the news editor for The Cradle, and I'm joined by my colleagues, content creator and writer for The Cradle, Karim Shami, and columnist and editor for The Cradle, Sharmin Narwani. And before we start, we just want to remind you to please leave a like, to share, to subscribe to our channel, to follow us on our social media accounts, and to check out our Patreon, where you can become a supporter and help us continue to do the work that we do here at The Cradle. So today, as we start, Lebanon finally has a new government, an official government, after almost 2.5 years since elections it has taken for this to happen. Well, the road has been long and arduous for Lebanon. But on Saturday, Prime Minister Nawaf Salam announces that a 24-member cabinet, including the so-called Shia duo, right, of Hezbollah and the Amal movement. And the announcement comes just a couple of days after this White House envoy travels to Beirut, meets with President Joseph Aoun, and gives a very inflammatory speech from above the palace, from the presidential palace, wearing a Star of David ring, saying Hezbollah has been defeated, and we want to thank Israel for defeating Hezbollah. And also, Hezbollah is not going to be part of the government. This is a U.S. red line, blah, 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 completely meddling publicly in Lebanon's internal affairs while standing next to the Lebanese president, right? Nevertheless, a new government formed. Hezbollah is part of the government, the Amal movement as well, their allies. So I want to get your guys' thoughts on this. What do we make of this new government, and what do you think the future will bring for Lebanon?
I mean, first of all, Hezbollah and its allies in Amal gained 5 ministerial posts in the cabinet of Nawaf Salam. This was the number going in after their initial negotiations. It stayed consistent, and that's what they got in the end. People seem to think that the holdup was these Hezbollah allied cabinet seats. They were not what held up the formation of the government. I would say possibly one of the, they were other sects that were horse trading right until the end, and mostly Christians and Sunnis. Not a negative reflection on any of these sects, by the way, just that's what happened. The Hezbollah Amal duo had their seats already secured. None for the Free Patriotic Movement, which until recently was the largest Christian political party in Lebanon, and was in an alliance with Hezbollah, with the Lebanese resistance, since 2006. So they received no ministerial posts and have officially, I believe, gone into opposition. 4 ministerial posts were for the right-wing extremist Lebanese forces, the people who perpetrated the massacres with the Israelis in Sabra and Shatila, the, Samir Jaja, who's a convicted murderer and was let out of prison over around 2 decades ago, and an ally of the Americans and Israelis. By not giving any ministries to the Free Patriotic Movement, however, the new government of Nawaf Salam basically cut the veto power that Hezbollah and its allies had in the previous government, which was, if you have 8 ministers, I believe it is, you can bring down the government. In this case, they have 5, 6 if you want to include the Marada party, Frangia's 1 cabinet seat, but they don't have the veto power anymore. And I think that was something that they were not pushing to get anyways. But, when you look at the makeup of the government, you have to consider that you don't get popular vote counts officially in Lebanese elections, because, as the Cradle has demonstrated in our Lebanese instruction tutorial from the time in 2022, you can read it, it's well written, and you still don't get it.
It's a little bit confusing.
It's very confusing. But Hezbollah, as in previous elections, has the the largest number of the popular vote, with around 350,000, followed by In this case, I mean, we got statistics from Al-Akhbar and we got statistics from, Karim, what's that website?
Lebanon debate.
Lebanon debate for these numbers. So they're ballpark, but not exact. So Hezbollah has over 344,000 votes. Amal has over 190,000 votes. Lebanese Forces has over 190,000 votes, and the Free Patriotic Movement has over 125,000 votes. So you can see that the Hezbollah and Amal duo have an absolute, advantage.
It's the resistance bloc, right? This is the bloc in parliament that has the biggest representation, not, I guess, support.
So correct. And so, well, in terms of popular vote, but that's not how the Lebanese government then gets formed. That's not how parliamentarians then get seats, etc. So you could say that, around 25% of the country has voted for the resistance bloc. What we also know privately is that the army chief, right? So President Joseph Aoun was until recently, the army commander, the commander of the Lebanese Armed Forces, and a U.S. favorite. He then became president, leaving the army commander's seat vacant. We understand that the army commander has been decided on and agreed on, but not announced. You have 200 other major directorships, if you want, that need to be named or have their tenures extended in this new government. And these are important roles. They're head of internal security forces, head of An-Nalam, which is the general security in the country. It's a post usually held by a Shiite and was temporarily handed over to a Christian candidate while government was being formed, but that has taken 2 years. More than 2 years? Is it more than 2 years? Yeah.
Yeah, it was almost 3 years now. We're getting close.
Oh my goodness,
Yeah,
so
elections are set for next year now.
Yeah, so the An-Nalam chief is, from what we understand, there are 3 candidates. One put forth by Joseph Aoun, another one tacitly approved by Joseph Aoun, and a third one that I don't know that much about. But the candidates are already, I think, shortlisted. What we don't know, however, at all, and we've discussed this on the podcast before, is we don't know of any platform for this government. When Joseph Aoun became president, we didn't know what his platform was. When Nawaf Salam was selected by Lebanon's parliament, we didn't know what his platform was. Nobody seems to run on platforms in this country, just on horse trading, usually with foreign backers, okay, sitting in foreign capitals, negotiating out a candidate. Okay, so we're still not clear what the priorities of this Lebanese government are. Is it an IMF loan that will bring some funds into Lebanon, but also create an indentured Lebanese economy, an economy indentured to the West?
Well, let me just mention Nawaf Salam, what he said, right? He said this is a government of salvation and reform. This is what he called it. And he also called it a unity government. So obviously, Lebanon, a country, as we have said so many times now in the podcast, just like one crisis on top of the other. And now this is the government that needs to confront them, right? The energy crisis, the economic crisis, the migrant, you have ISIS 2.0 next door dropping bombs on Lebanon, right? This has been happening over the past several days before the government formation, and I think even after. Lebanese tribes were getting attacked from Syria.
Yeah.
And, Israeli soldiers still in the south. Salam said Israel needs to withdraw from every inch of Lebanese territory. Well, now is the time to put, your money where your mouth is in all of these things.
But all governments say these things, right? Well, it doesn't matter what election you're looking at. They address the woes of the public, and they use language that's meant to sell their candidacy, and then we don't know. It usually doesn't manifest in governance. But I think, Lebanon is in a series of crises. One is obviously the financial crisis, the collapse of the country's financial system in 2019. Another is, of course, the over 1.5 million Syrian refugees still remaining in this country, and the removal of them, sending them back to Syria, which you can only do if Syria is safe. The threat from the southern border, obviously, the occupation of Israeli troops, and now, obviously, clashes on Lebanon's eastern border with Syria that blew up last week and continue into this week in Syrian border towns where there are Lebanese residents. HTS, the ruling faction in the Syrian government, has sent its forces there. Some of these guys have been videoed wearing ISIS patches. They're supposedly there to control Lebanon's sovereignty, which is a legitimate thing. But by evicting the residents of the town, anyone who's Lebanese of origin, and also making the argument that we're trying to control smuggling routes, right? Which is such an Israeli and American talking point, right? They don't want Hezbollah weapons coming into.
But Israel just bombed also, right? The east of Lebanon.
Yeah.
Right?
So then, just as HTS is starting a fight on the Lebanese border, Israel then bombs right next to that conflict in Bekaa yesterday. So, when we talk about Al-Qaeda and Israel going hand in hand, you can see the coordination in so many ways, including, by the way, when the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad fell, right? There was a massive HTS and Israeli rally for territorial grabs, pretty much at the same time.
You can grab more.
Yeah, but there are far more, pressing problems for the average Lebanese, like maybe having access to 24/7 electricity one day or 24/7 running water. So, there's a lot for this government to handle. Economy is obviously huge. But so are basic services that all citizens in a country that is relatively wealthy in terms of there's a lot of money that flows into this country, have not prioritized in previous governments. And then, of course, the occupations and clashes on at least two borders. So, we have to wait and see.
What do you think, Karim? You're a Lebanese man. Give us your thoughts.
Yeah,
Did you vote in the elections?
me?
Yeah.
I never voted. I never did that. Well, I prefer on Sundays to stay at home. Usually the votings are on.
It's an experience. You should do it just for the, experience value, if nothing else. Like I vote in every single election I can. There's something about those days that are magical, people coming together. But granted, governance doesn't seem to change. And so it puts a lot of people like you.
Especially in Lebanon.
If they changed how we vote in Lebanon, for instance, if I was able to vote for a president that has full power, of course I will vote, but I will not go vote for a parliament seat or a member who.
Yeah.
That's why I don't vote. So what's happening? First, let's talk about Lebanon. First, what happened in Lebanon shows us how delusional are the Americans under the leadership of Trump. It shows us that they know nothing. He brought this envoy. Her name is Ortegos, if not.
Morgan Ortegas, yeah.
Ortegos or Ortega?
I don't know. Who knows?
Okay. So Ortegas came on behalf of Trump and gave this speech in Lebanon, which made me very angry as a Lebanese, not because she said that. We know who the Americans are and the Israelis and other countries. But what made me furious is that nobody from the journalists stood up and told her, you can't say that. So that's what made me angry. So back to our point, this shows us that the Americans under the leadership of Trump, they have no idea what they are saying. This applies to what he said regarding Greenland, Panama, Canada, and now this applies in Lebanon. Yeah, the envoy came and said there will be no Hezbollah members in the new government, and she said that the president assured her about that, and 1 hour later, the new president of Lebanon, Joseph Aoun, said this didn't happen. And the following day, we saw, as Sharmin said, there's 5 people who are aligned with Hezbollah in the government. This tells us that they are just saying stuff that can be done. And similarly, maybe this applies to Gaza, because Netanyahu just today also said that he doubled down. He said that Gaza is a very beautiful place and that he wants to buy Gaza. And he said that many countries can go there. And today I read in Hebrew media, they said that if Egypt and Jordan said no, we can take them to Somaliland or to other African places. So
this
means he said the Saudis, right? He said no, it was
It is not
the
also.
Saudis.
Yeah, but the Saudis now, they saw, okay, the Arabs don't want, we can go take them to Africa, and especially they mentioned Somaliland. This shows us that not whatever everything that a president says happens, especially Trump, because he really is delusional, and I think, as I said it last time, he takes his news or ideas only from one source, which is the Israelis, and he doesn't understands the region, and this is that's very weird that you have an envoy for the Middle East, and for her to say that.
But I remember Ronald Reagan being called the Teflon president. He could get away with anything. This was a former Hollywood actor who then became president. Trump is a former real estate developer, reality TV star who became president. He's globbing onto something he could have heard an hour ago that took his fancy, and then spits it out in an interview an hour later, and the whole world comes to a standstill. We've got to stop reacting to everything this man says. We have to look at the actions and not the words. And I don't want to spend any more Cradle time talking about what this guy says, because he's always going to say out-of-the-box inflammatory things, and we're not going to react to everything he says. He has this big idea about he's going to own Gaza. He's used that word. We're going to own Gaza, okay, and let the Israelis handle it and stuff. And there's going to be no Hamas. We're going to develop it. It's going to be beautiful.
The Riviera of the Middle East.
Yeah, but as though travelers are going to say, oh, wow, let's go to Gaza with, see the new skyline and the beach, when they can go to other Mediterranean spots that are well established. I mean, it's not something that's going to be a great sound. Anyways, the point is, of course, Arab countries are not going to accept this, not remotely. Their legitimacy will be blown out of the water the next second, with their own populations. Not to mention that the domestic crises that would unfold with, hundreds of thousands of people spilling across their borders who need the basics to live. What Arab country can support this? It's not going to happen. Trump says they can be persuaded, but we're observers of West Asia, and we observe the region acutely every single day. So let's not give oxygen to these ridiculous ideas until we see there's some action come out of it. And I want to go to something factual that is interesting and absolutely blew up on the Cradle's website and on our social media, which was former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Gallant is the other guy alongside Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has had arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court. He is a wanted war criminal and cannot travel. Okay. He was the Minister of Defense during the entire war until just a few months ago, right? The entire genocidal war in Gaza. Gallant has acknowledged during a TV interview last week that the army was ordered to use the Hannibal directive to kill Israeli civilians and soldiers during the October 7th attack by the Palestinians on resistance on, the Al-Aqsa flood operation. During an interview with Israel's Channel 12, just a few days ago, and it's this first interview since being dismissed as defense minister, Gallant admitted to ordering himself the controversial protocol that involves killing captives along with their captors. So the controversial Hannibal directive is controversial even in Israel, which basically says if an enemy is taking Israeli soldiers captive, kill the soldiers as well as the captors, right? But in this case, it's, I think, not the first time, but the first time so widely.
It's the first time such an official at such a high level has said it, right? Because as you said, he was the defense minister. He was the man in charge of the genocide.
Oh, yeah, no. I'm saying it's the first time that the Israelis or different levels of Israelis are admitting the use of Hannibal directives against Israeli civilians, not just Israeli soldiers, for which it was created. Okay, but we believe in other instances, smaller instances that have not been scrutinized, Israel has killed its civilians in order to, to not have the enemy gain advantage. But in this case, and the Cradle was one of the first, if not the first, to shine a light on this, literally days after October 7th.
We were reporting on it since November, at least. Since November 2023, we were already reporting on it.
In gruesome detail, how the Israeli military forces were shooting at everything that moved on the Gaza border, including Israelis who were being transported back by their captors. And there are Israelis, citizens who have said their parent, their relative, their family member were killed by Israeli forces on that day. So, he said, Israel claims Hamas killed roughly 1,100 Israeli civilians and soldiers during its attack on Israeli military bases and settlements, as part of the October 7th operation. But Israeli forces killed huge numbers of their own civilians and soldiers during this attack. And now you have the defense minister at the time revealing that he gave that order.
Yeah, it's. I think this is, this is a story that, as you said, we have been covering at the Cradle for a year and a half now, more than a year and a half. And every time it happens, it kind of blows up on social media. Because why? Because you have Yoav Gallant on TV saying, yes, we did actually issue the Hannibal directive, and no single Western media outlet has even mentioned it. It went like it didn't happen, right? And many of the Cradle's reports. And it's even like one of the reasons why we keep, getting banned from Meta, is because we just say what is already saying, right? What the Israeli media is reporting. The Israeli media, Haaretz and other outlets have already said. Israel Hayom had an article a few days ago talking about that 11,000 shells or something like that were fired by the Israeli army on the, terrorists on October 7th, and just like describing a level of violence that was unleashed that day. And this comes hand in hand with Yoav Gallant saying we did issue the Hannibal directive. So this whole thing of Hamas atrocities and they killed so many people and it was 50 9/11s and et cetera, it's a lie. We've been saying it at the Cradle. It's a lie. It has been a lie for so long. And even when the confirmation comes, the silence remains. Right, the silence, the complicit silence from the West remains, and is treated as it's not even treated as a conspiracy theory anymore by them. But then, thankfully, there's outlets like us, there's other independent outlets that come and report the truth, report the words that are being said by Israeli officials, and it shows that people are no longer buying into that narrative, right? Into the narrative that Israel, even on the day that the Palestinian resistance carries out this attack to take captives and possibly reclaim some of the land, they are not the culprits of the deaths. They were not responsible, right? Because the Palestinians came in with their AKs and what else, right? Like a few grenade launchers. They didn't come with Apache helicopters.
No. And this also speaks to the rave, the Nova Music Festival that, people went, they were attending a concert and they got butchered by these people. The Israeli police force very early on in an investigation acknowledged and reported that Hamas fighters did not seem to be aware that a music festival was going on, along the path of their operation. And then we learned later that, in fact, the festival had been postponed till the following day, which is the day it actually occurred. So they wouldn't have known, Hamas wouldn't have known this when they launched their operations at 6 a.m. Those hundreds and hundreds of burnt vehicles as well. The Cradle was, again, among the first writing that this was not created by Hamas fighters who were coming in with the machine guns, on motorcycles and tow trucks across the Gaza border, but by helicopter fire, by the Apache helicopters that the Israelis had put in the air and were opening fire on anyone who moved and anything that moved. And don't forget, one of the things we learned early on was Hamas fighters were told, in any situation you're trying to escape, don't run, walk, because they will assume anyone running is an enemy combatant. And in fact, it was the Israeli civilians and soldiers who were doing the running, whereas Hamas wasn't, So they were shooting at anything they saw. But, by the way, speaking of Gallant and the ICC arrest warrant, Washington, just is the first to now. Washington is now planning to hit the ICC chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, a British national, with U.S. sanctions imposed by President Trump. We learned this 2 days ago. Trump's sanctions include freezing U.S. assets of those designated and prohibiting both them and their family members from visiting the U.S. We know about Karim Khan, but this will be part of a series of sanctions levied against the International Criminal Court. The ICC and 80 nations condemned Trump's executive order and vowed to continue their mission of providing justice to innocent victims of atrocities across the world. That's what they're there for. It's, just as an aside, Karim Khan, I think this has been, the British papers, has been a target of Israeli campaigns for years to smear him. There are sexual allegations against him, etc. None of these were brought up until the ICC started looking at Israel, arresting Israeli leaders in relation to the Gaza genocide. Khan has said a few months ago, I think it was in the last fall, that ICC officials were receiving personal threats from supporters of Russia and Israel. So this is something, we've seen Trump now on, right off the bat, withdrawing from the World Health Organization, withdrawing from, just as he did last
Human Rights Council, too.
Yes, the UN Human Rights Council, etc. But it's interesting, the UN Human Rights Council has been a big target of the Israelis for a long time, because the Human Rights Council regularly looks at claims of violations, and Israel is constantly under scrutiny for violations in the territories it occupies. So Israel calls it anti-Semitic. It's probably given Trump, Netanyahu, do you think he gave Trump a laundry list of organizations to exit from? The point is, just as Trump's little photo op with the new Gulf of America replacing Gulf of Mexico, what difference does it make if the U.S. leaves all of these institutions? We've talked about this on the podcast before. If it's just the U.S. and Micronesia, and Israel, what difference does it make? Because the hold on. So the ICC, the U.S. and Israel are not state members of the ICC, or not held. What is that word? They're not.
They are not signatories to the Rome Statute.
Yeah, the U.S. and Israel are not signatories to the Rome Statute. Yeah. Okay, so they don't play with the ICC anyways. But what the ICC can do without U.S.-Israeli interference is basically launch suits and convict individuals charged with crimes against humanity and war crimes, and then all the other signatories, the 100 plus whatever states that are signatories to the Rome Statute, then are, will have to bar travel to their territories by the convicted people, individuals. And so, I've argued that, if the U.S. even bails out of the UN will be moved out of New York somewhere else. So the U.S. will set up its alternative world order. But let's be honest, the U.K. and France, allies of the U.S., still sit as, 2 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. They're going to want to keep their sliver of legitimacy with the rest of the world. They're not going to bail and just become part of this U.S. front. We may see the world splitting into areas of influence, right? U.S. controlled and then the other. But how much does it hurt anyone if the U.S. unilaterally withdraws from everything. Guess what? You don't get U.S. funds, and the U.S. is oftentimes the largest or among the largest donors to these various organizations. But then these are organizations like USAID, whatever, that have become so ridiculous and moved so far from their original missions that not having U.S. money, ergo U.S. influence there, can actually help move them back to their natural original forms and missions. So I'm not seeing this as necessarily a bad thing, but Karim, you obviously disagree.
Yeah, I want to go back also. So I was talking about Lebanon and that what the Americans wanted in Lebanon didn't happen. But I want to say it might happen in Gaza because there's Israel who like this idea of Netanyahu and they are pushing for it. What it will succeed or no, nobody knows, but they are pushing for it. And I think in the couple of coming months, we will see them like pushing more or like taking notes and asking people, do you want to go there? And especially that now there's Qataris and Egyptians in Gaza and they have the influence to ask people and, for instance, to get any aligned journalists with Israel, Arabs that are aligned with Israel, and they are unfortunately many, and they will try to influence, and we'll see what will happen. And regarding what's happening in the borders with Lebanon, it's very dangerous. We didn't talk about it as we should, I think. Today, HTS fighters, and I don't say the Syrian army because I want to ask our viewers to go and see these people. If you think they are military personnel, then I will call them the army. They are still big beards, T-shirts, wearing T-shirts. You don't see anything official from them. They are trying to do what the UK failed to do in Lebanon. They are trying to maintain the borders between Lebanon and Syria in an aggressive way. The UK managed to build around 30 watchtowers on the border between Syria and Lebanon. And they said that this is for to like fight smuggling. But of course, they did all this to fight the weapons that go in and out from Syria and to Lebanon. And I know this thing, if we are a normal country and we are in a normal conflict, I am against this. Well, of course, the region is abnormal currently. And what's happening in West Asia is abnormal. And of course, the conflict between us and the Israelis is a very weird and difficult conflict. And this means that we should find another ways to smuggle weapons because everybody is against Hezbollah. So Hezbollah used to smuggle weapons and to transfer weapons into and out to Lebanon through Syria. And the UK managed to build 38 watchtowers, if I'm not mistaken, to monitor what's happening, and they failed. And now what's happening is that HTS or Al-Julani or Al-Sharia is doing what others failed to do. I think all these convoys and him meeting the Europeans and the Americans for the main reason they met him is for this, I think. Or one of the most prominent thing they met him or talk about in the behind closed doors is this, because there's a new Syria is doing nothing against Israel. Yesterday and the day before and the day before and the day before, Israel bombed Syria. They bombed south of Damascus yesterday, 20 kilometers south of Damascus. I have people that I know that live in Damascus. Everybody in Damascus heard the bombings. And you don't even find a statement from the state media, I'm not saying official, of what's happening in Syria, what Israel is doing in Syria. And of course, what's happening in the north, Turkey is every day bombing north of Syria, and there's conflicts and clashes between the SDF, which are the armed groups in Syria against like SNA and other factions. So what's happening now, the only focus on the Lebanese border. And to be honest, Syrians benefit from this smuggling because there's nothing in Syria now.
Yeah.
So he's willing to like even deepen the situation in his country just to stop smuggling some light weapons, because I don't think they are like big weapons. And just today, they bombed a school in Lebanon. And there's pictures now. People will see the school. It was bombed by HTS, but of course, you won't see anything about that in the media and even in Lebanese media, because also the Lebanese media is very happy of what's happened in Syria now, and they consider Al-Julani like he lives and acts and breathes like them. That's what they
Because they're all funded by USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy and all those programs that Trump cut. But like Karim, in a nutshell, Turkish troops and military is running amok in northern Syria. The Israelis
just bombed Kobani or like
yeah,
Anwar.
yeah.
They are releasing footages and HD videos, but nobody reports it.
The Israelis are occupying southern Syria and as of a few days ago are making more land grabs and bombing near the capital. And yet HTS is fighting over a piddling little village dispute on its border with Lebanon, talking about protecting its sovereignty. Okay, everything HDS does is aligned with Western goals, okay? The Western Alliance's goals. This is, I mean, can you imagine, you know how small these villages are? And you know, like how long Lebanese have lived in some of these villages? And you're entirely right, Karim. For years now, especially since the Caesar Act sanctions, U.S. Caesar Act sanctions hit Syria, the smuggling is overwhelmingly the other way, taking Lebanese-based goods and moving them across the border to Syria, whether it's smuggled fuel, food, medicines, you name it, and not the other way around. So why is HTS spending any time at the Lebanese border? It's because of its Western masters, you know, the instructions to stop every avenue for weapons to come to Hezbollah in Lebanon. But, you know, that's like assuming that Hezbollah is still going to be focusing on a Syrian territorial route to get there. You know, it's kind of bizarre. That sums up where HTS is on the geopolitical map of the Levant. Again, follow the actions, not the words.
I mean,
Yeah, regarding the defunding of UN or pulling out of UN, for me, I think the United States already controls the UN and like the prominent aspects of UN, but in different ways. Biden and the previous administrations, they controlled it via money, but now and they use soft power. I think Trump and his administration, they don't believe in soft power.
Yeah.
So what they are doing harsh decisions against this. They don't like even the long terms. And for instance, the Biden administration and previous, since the 40s, there are states, they have the patience. For instance, if they want something, they have like the patience 10 years, 15 years to accomplish it through this soft power, through the UN and through other places, through the USAID and other stuff. Now Trump thinks he has the most powerful economy in the world, the most powerful army in the world. We don't need soft power. We need to do it as it is. I tell you what to do, and you have to do what I tell you. So I think this, in the long term, and after 1 year or 2 years, we will see the effects of what these decisions will have in the world. But defunding or getting out of UN will hurt the UN very much, because the United States, I think, in some places, they fund more than 50% of UN. Yani, for instance, UNIFIL, I think it's funded, the majority is from the United States. You have UNICEF. There's many things there.
Karim, the UN started with a UN charter, okay, and a mission basically to prohibit war, to prevent war, or to regulate war. And moving, you know, in a...
Failed a bit, huh?
They failed a bit. Then you had the Cold War after that, and then you had these two poles, and then you entered a unipolar world at the end of the Cold War, right? And what has happened, the head of the unipolar world is the United States, which its permanent state has advocated and been responsible for most of the wars, the displacement of mass populations, starvation, sieges, etc., in the world, right? And as a result, over that time, 25 major UN agencies developed, okay, from the founding of the UN. The thing is, if you don't have wars, if you don't have these aggressive foreign policies, you don't have the mass displacement, the hunger, the loss of sovereignty where countries are dependent like beggars on like foreign investors who then control their a lot would change if the U.S. literally gave up on the UN. If the U.S. cut its funding, you'd get a scale back of these things. Now,
maybe that will not be a UN. It happened before, Sharmeen.
Well, you had the League of Nations, and then it was reformed into the UN. You're right. But this is also, the UN experiment hasn't worked. And so maybe you will have, as we've talked with the Cradle before, two spheres of influence in the world, two poles, if you will, in which one continues with the financial networks, the transportation networks, the telecommunications networks, the banking messaging networks, insurance networks, et cetera, that keep the entire economies of these countries going, which will be lessened because there's another pole, let's say the BRICS pole, okay, of rising powers and superpowers that are creating their own networks for all these things, their own alternative systems, right? And you could end up in a situation like that. Then do you need a UN other than, a bare bones that focuses on its initial mission, which is to maybe mediate in conflict situations and weigh in on issues like sovereignty, territorial violations, et cetera? I'm not bothered by a UN this ridiculous and inefficient and unproductive and almost like, it's become an institution that to justify its funding hypes up conflict, and seems to like conflict so they can get like funding for these things. I mean, there people have written about this extensively, the ins and outs of humanitarian funding. I'm not bothered by this system collapsing by the removal of the U.S. Maybe it'll just shrink it down to size. Right?
I don't think any of them are much bothered. Let me jump in here because I want to mention a couple of things. First of all, Marco Rubio's statements from the start of this month, in which he said that the unipolar order was an anomaly, he called it, and that we are headed down the road in which is essentially the first time a high-ranking, Secretary of State saying, admitting that there's a multipolar world order being formed. So I think that, plus everything that you guys have are discussing, right, about the UN and the US and the collapse of the system. I think, what has happened with Donald Trump, not even a month into his presidency, is the collapse of this facade, right? But that's why we're defunding USAID and looking into, all of these, funding of thousands of journalists around the world. Like 9 out of 10 Ukrainian media outlets funded by USAID, and they call themselves independent. This is it.
And waiting for the numbers.
In Lebanon is gonna be insane when we finally see in every country. But what I'm getting at is also I want to mention the in this rupture we're seeing kind of some nations take a stance, right? And I think one of the ones that have gone completely under the radar is the formation of what is known as the Hague Group, right? Which is this group of around 9 nations, I think. Then none of them Arab, by the way. None of them Arab. You have Belize, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Honduras, half of Latin America, Malaysia, Namibia, Senegal, and South Africa coming together to uphold the rulings of the ICJ and the ICC in relation to the genocide in Gaza and to pursue justice, right? So you have all of a sudden these global South nations coming together and saying like, obviously there's a break in the world order that we have been, the international rules-based order, whatever, no longer exists. So we need to start, some of us at least, upholding international law, because this is what really the thing with the Gaza, we're going to own Gaza, and the thing, we're going to own the Panama Canal and the Gulf of America, and just all of this. In reality, what it hides is or I don't know if hides is the right word, right? It just represents is the collapse of international law in the eyes of the United States, right? They are saying we're no longer going to keep up with this facade that we are, the harbingers of democracy. We are thugs, and we're going to act like thugs.
So it's not the United States; it's Trump specifically, and Trump specifically wants to focus his interests on where he believes are actual U.S. interests, more urgent, more lucrative, okay? He does not want to pay for the rest of the world, which is what the neoliberal order was really, really happy to do forevermore. He's not doing this as a favor to the rest of the world, but it is kind of a favor. And I want to point out that, there are many in countries like Iran and Russia and China who are delighted by Trump because he wants to move U.S. tentacles out of kind of everything. If he wants to pick fights with Greenland, Canada, okay, and Mexico, Somaliland, they don't care unless, of course, then Somaliland and Mexico become members of the BRICS, in which they will care. Point is, let Trump shrink America's world. This is really good for everyone else. Why Trump repeats this thing about the Iranians wanting to assassinate him is so as far away from reality as possible. I've been told years ago by a very, very top security official in this region, if you're getting threats of assassination, never mention them publicly, because it gives a perfect opportunity for even your side to take you out and false flag it, right? Blaming the enemy. I'm sure the Israelis and Netanyahu came over with listen, we have tangible evidence of Iranian plans to assassinate you. Trump, of course, would mouth this out. The Israelis would have more interest in knocking off Trump if he pushes a ceasefire deal right to the end, or the Europeans, neoliberal European leaders and EU leaders would be more motivated to knock off Trump because he wants to make good with the Russians and end the Ukraine war than the Iranians, who absolutely, like the Chinese and Russians, benefit from Trump trying to shrink America's world. Be logical. It is not the Iranians. The Iranians will not be assassinating Trump. He is gold for that.
He said that he has left orders to destroy Iran, right? To essentially wipe it off the map if he gets assassinated. And I think anyone who has been paying attention, what this is really is just saying, asking the Mossad to kill him, right? At this point, he's like, you signed an order? Well, let's put some plans into motion so that we can actually...
It would have been way easier to assassinate Trump and Pompeo and Brian Hook and all those guys, after Trump left office, by far, than waiting until he's in the White House with, secure. So, of course, Iran's not going to assassinate him. Of course, if Trump gets killed, it will be somebody from his alliance who doesn't want the extreme measures he's taking to reshape the U.S.'s role in the world. Think of how many of his allies now are hemorrhaging money and can no longer count on the billions of dollars that were free-flowing their way in the past.
I agree. I agree what you said. I want us to move on to what's happening in the West Bank, because the escalation has been truly shocking. Shocking is the right word, just, horrifying. Because what we're seeing is the Gaza Strip be moved entirely to the West Bank. And I think this falls exactly under this conversation that we're having about international law, about, what does it even mean anymore? Trump wants to buy Gaza. The West Bank is getting, destroyed as we speak. The Israeli troops are using Palestinians as human shields again. They have loosened open fire restrictions. I so often don't know what that means, because honestly, we see Israeli troops act with such impunity anywhere that they go, anywhere that they are, that when they say we loosen open fire restrictions, they're already killing civilians. They're already sniping women and children. I don't know what that means. In any case, that's what.
Actually, just to that point, before joining this podcast, I read something the Hebrew newspaper Haaretz reported today that the Israeli army has expanded its open fire orders in the West Bank, which is what's led to the increase in Palestinian civilian deaths. It quotes commanders of units in the Israeli army. Now, the Israeli army denies this, okay? But Haaretz is quoting actual commanders of units in the Israeli army in the West Bank that its central command decided to implement an open fire mechanism, the same one it used in Gaza to kill any unarmed Palestinian, whether suspected or not, in the West Bank. So basically, if it moves, kill it.
Yeah,
that's the new policy. And Haaretz is confirming this. They explained that these broad open fire orders made it easier for soldiers to pull the trigger. And this came at the behest of the Central Command Commander Avi Balut, okay? Balut is allowing, essentially, Israelis to kill Palestinians without resorting to arrest, without resorting to stop and search and anything, just sniping, basically.
Just moves.
Yeah. And the newspaper actually, Haaretz explains that an Israeli military force is now used civilians to search buildings in the West Bank to contain explosives. They're starting to human shield as they go into refugee camps and other main areas in the West Bank, highly populated and densely populated areas, similar, Haaretz says, to what happened in the Gaza Strip when the Israeli army used civilians as human shields. I mean, right now, the circle of fire, as the Cradle's recent headline goes on this, has expanded into Tulkarem after, I think, 20 days, almost 3 weeks of launching attacks from fighter jets, from drones, by the Israeli army on Jenin. So Jenin, Tulkarem, and now Tubas. And it's just expanding. I mean, basically, I think Israel sees this as an opportunity to do their ethnic cleansing in the West Bank as they did in Gaza and create hyper focus on it with Trump as the U.S. president, backed by major Israel donors to his campaign who have been pushing annexation of the West Bank. We've also noticed Israeli officials increasingly in this government openly talking about annexing the West Bank and expelling millions of Palestinians. Just today, Israel's education minister said, quote, "It's time to impose Israeli sovereignty on the West Bank. The presence of Trump's administration is a historic opportunity for that." So, as we said, Israel can't stop warring. If it's going to be forced into ceasefire in Gaza, the Cradle said ages ago it will just turn its attention onto the West Bank and other theaters, as it has.
Entirely. Karim, why don't you share what do you think about what's happening in the West Bank?
Yeah, what's happening in the West Bank is what Israelis try to do in Gaza. They are pushing the Palestinians away. But in Gaza, they used more power. In the West Bank, they can't because people, when they look at the map and they see the West Bank, people might mistakenly think that this is the West Bank and here where our Palestinians live. It's not like that. The West Bank is like small islands. Inside the West Bank, we have some villages or some towns where Palestinians live, and they are surrounded also by Israeli settlements.
So it wasn't like that. It's that you have had since Oslo, since the peace agreement, basically Israelis building Jews-only roads, having Jews-only areas, Jews-only license plates, etc. They've been slowly dividing up the West Bank. I think we've all seen on social media and other places the famous pictures of Israel or the West Bank since 1967 when it was occupied, and how it's just dwindled down to little population points for Palestinians in what was entirely their territory, uncontested.
What happened is that since Netanyahu was elected and he had Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, I think this was the idea since the beginning. And I think the Gaza war delayed this, and now they are continuing it. What's happening now is not only the army. We have the army, we have the police, and we have the PA, which is the Palestinian Authority. They tried to do that and they failed. And now the Israeli army stepped in. And let's not forget that even before 7 October, what the settlers used to do, and they are continuing to do, and they were armed by Ben-Gvir. If you're a settler there, you got weapons for free. So what's happening is that
and training.
And training. So what's happening is that, for instance, like Jenin is a stronghold for the resistance. So the army is responsible for this. They are killing people there. They are bulldozering.
Yeah.
And there's other places, for instance, other villages or small towns. They are being stormed daily by settlers. They either burn the houses there, burn the cars, burn any place. Even like a small coffee shop where Palestinians sit there, the settlers will come and burn it. And systematically, people are fleeing these areas. And just today, I saw many Palestinians. They said around 16,000 Palestinians were displaced from the south to the north in the West Bank, inside the West Bank. So that's what's happening. So there's places that are being ethnically cleansed by the army, and they are using the airplanes. Usually they don't use airplanes in the West Bank. And other places, they are being burned and targeted by the settlers.
Yeah, to be honest, they started this under Joe Biden's administration, but they're going to feel very emboldened by Trump because Trump, what has Trump done? He's gone after the ICC, he's gone after the institutions and the courts that could censure Israelis, that could convict them of crimes, etc. So I understand when the education minister says we have like this brilliant window of opportunity with Trump to do all these mad things. And one of the things that Israelis have always planned is to create the Palestinian state in Jordan, right? To basically annex all of the West Bank and Jerusalem and displace all West Bank Palestinians into Jordan and that be named the Palestinian state. I am sure this plan is going to go into hyperdrive during the Trump administration, and it really is up to the Arab states to stop it, to thwart it, to draw some lines. If it gets that extreme, I actually am sure they will. Yeah. Unless everyone is willing, meaning the Saudis, the Emiratis, everybody is willing to forfeit Jordan, which honestly they might do because Jordan's not very useful since King Hussein died. He was an actual mediator in the region. He put Jordan on the map as a mediating country between Arabs and between Muslim states, and therefore made it relevant. King Abdullah is up against a wall. He only allies with people who pay him, and they, understanding that, they pay him less and less over time. So I think Jordan is in serious danger with the escalating situation. But let's talk about why the West Bank ramped up so much. Okay, so warring Netanyahu has to continue his war somewhere. It's the only way for him to put off his court cases in his mind. And now we're looking at ceasefire deadlines, okay? In 7 or 8 days, right? In about a week, the extended deadline for the ceasefire with Lebanon comes to an end. All Israeli troops must be withdrawn from Lebanese territory. And then we are already supposed to be in hot negotiations for the second phase of the Israel ceasefire with the Palestinian resistance in Gaza. And what is happening there? The Cradle just wrote a piece on this. Israelis saying Netanyahu intends to sabotage the second phase of the prisoner release deal. Gallant, by the way, in his interview a few days ago, also said, he blames Netanyahu. We could have gotten the hostages out through a negotiation, through a ceasefire long ago in safer conditions.
He said that the deal was in place since July.
Yeah. And basically, Netanyahu says it was in place months ago. I okayed it. Hamas kept changing the deal terms. We know from Israeli sources directly, it was Netanyahu that kept changing deal terms. In this case, Trump does want to see a ceasefire because he doesn't want his attention diverted again by wars. He doesn't understand the situation enough. He doesn't get into detail on areas he's not interested enough to understand that Netanyahu is just continuing more of the same in Gaza elsewhere. But, he's just focused on the ceasefire. They're supposed to meet in Qatar, right?
They apparently, I was reading this, the Qataris seem to be very upset at Israel. They are saying, you sent us a delegation last week, you sent us a delegation with absolutely no
negotiating power. Yeah,
exactly. With no negotiating power. They just came and sat and looked at their hands because they couldn't do anything. They had absolutely no green light to approve of anything. And as you said, this is as the second round of talks I guess the continued talks for the second round of the ceasefire are supposed to be ongoing right now. So the Qataris are apparently, allegedly, very upset at Israel, and they're reminding Israel, we are a party to this, right? You are not the only ones with obligations. We are also have obligations. So everybody needs to continue with this process. Yesterday, the Israeli troops left Netzarim corridor, right? The Islam corridor in the middle of Gaza. And the devastation that we're seeing from there, it's pretty gruesome, honestly.
They bulldozed over actual human beings to pave the way for their little corridor. I mean, we're seeing like chunks of human bodies, okay,
Well, CNN did come out with a report a few months ago about how the Israeli soldiers couldn't eat ground meat anymore because they were just so disgusted by what they had done in Gaza. And now we're seeing the repercussions. The government media office is talking about 600 bodies found so far and 14,000 missing. So the landscape.
Imagine paving a road, deciding to build important strategic highway, and then going, well, the leftover people who refuse to sell their property or move out, nobody's looking. Let's just ground them into the ground. Let's just ground them. I mean, that's exactly what's happened. We're finding skulls and human remains all over this place. So the other thing that's happening is the Netzarim corridor. Of course, the Palestinians are making such a big deal of it. The Israelis have fully withdrawn. Woo-hoo-hoo. Every one of these things, including the sort of Hamas theater around the release of Israeli hostages, has made Netanyahu's knuckles white, okay, and his entire cabinet, the extremist, fascistic, right-wing, genocidal maniacs who cannot bear to have had complete media control for 15 months, and now these images are undermining everything they claim to their own populations. So,
let me just mention, because I just remembered this, that today Yediot and Aronot, the Israeli newspaper, came out with apparently Netanyahu's demands for the second phase. And these are expelling Hamas leadership from Gaza, dismantling the Qassam brigades, these the soldiers that are standing with Israeli weapons during these ceremonies, and securing the release of all Israeli captives, obviously, number 3 for him. So this is apparently, where he's coming from now. And number 1 and 2, especially number 2, right? Expelling the Qassam brigades from Gaza, that's dismantling them. The whole genocide happened, and it didn't work.
Yeah, but the framework for part 1, phase 1, 2, and 3 of the ceasefire have already been outlined. Anyone who adds to it will be, called out. Obviously not in mainstream media, and obviously not by the Trump White House for putting a wrench in the works. But in fact, this phase also sees Israel moving out of, I think, all of Gaza. And again, it's worth mentioning that the first phase, I think people's attentions have been focused on the exchange of prisoners by both sides, because it's the humanitarian story, right? But actually, what's being missing from the headlines is the fact that under the first phase of the ceasefire, designated amount of humanitarian aid and reinstitution of basic services are supposed to go into effect, and that is not being allowed by the Israelis. So I don't know how you start phase 2 when phase 1 isn't being implemented already by the Israelis. And of course, Netanyahu doesn't really want it to happen, whereas in Lebanon, the situation is maybe more doable because all those other components aren't there. It is an actual physical withdrawal of Israeli troops. Now, the Israelis today or yesterday, I can't remember, said a full withdrawal from the eastern front of Lebanon is happening, has happened, will take place, right? The main situation is that the attention is now on, it's a more achievable ceasefire in Lebanon than the many, many components that have to be considered in any ceasefire stage phase of the Gaza agreement. So do you think, Karim, that we're going to achieve a complete Israeli withdrawal in 8 days?
I hope so, because if it was not achieved, we don't know what the next step will be. Will Hezbollah just say we are behind the government that I'm 100% sure will do nothing, or Hezbollah will fight back? Are they able to fight back now? And because we know what happened in Syria. Syria was very, very important. So we don't know what will happen. Will the Americans and the Arab countries will pressure more Hezbollah? No, don't fight, wait more. We have no idea. Especially that Israel, as you mentioned, they are still going into Syrian territory. And the places that they are in Lebanon, they are adjacent to these territories. So I don't know what the plan of the Israeli is. But again, of course, the Netzarim corridor is far more important than any village in southern Lebanon. So what I think to myself, if they withdrew from there, they can withdraw from Lebanon. But now the call is all upon Israel. I don't think the Lebanese government has the connections or the power or the
So
economy to do anything.
So withdrawing from the Netzarim corridor basically allows free flow of Palestinians in Gaza from south to north, from north to south, without Israeli checkpoints, which was the first phase of the ceasefire. The Israelis were checking people and vehicles. But
to add a piece of this information also, the Israelis said that they want to cut Gaza. So the plan was that northern of this corridor, which is the Salim corridor, will be fully occupied by Israel. And they also made these conferences, what they should name the places there, who should take the land. So now this doesn't exist.
yeah, it doesn't exist, but actually, do they care about vacating Netzarim? Because as many people who went to the north of Gaza saw, there was like no structure in which to live in. Okay, so even if you were and then this is what Israel's doing. It's like cutting off. If there's like 5,000 trucks supposed to come in, there's only in actuality 500 trucks that are being allowed in. So not providing the basics so that people in northern Gaza can reestablish life there means, for the time being, Netzarim isn't that important to them, to the Israelis. Do you know what I'm saying?
No, it's very important, because all what they did in the war, the biggest achievement is Netzarim. They did the road, they put asphalt, they put buildings, they put checkpoints. They wanted to annex the northern Gaza from northern Netzarim to Ashkelon or to...
Correct.
No. They wanted this land, in their heads, before Trump came, in their heads, the Israelis, land is ours, we will make settlement, and the Gazans will remain southern of this.
But I'm saying...
Why? Yeah, I'm telling you why it's very important. Also, because most of the missiles that were fired into Ashkelon and into Tel Aviv and to other places were launched from northern Gaza, because northern Gaza is closer to these vital cities in Israel. So what they wanted to do is to cut this piece of land, which is like, I think, 14 or 20 kilometers. It depends from where you measure it. So if Hamas was wanted to fire again missiles or manufacture missiles, it would be very hard for them to reach these places. That's militarily why they did this.
Karim, I understand that fully. What I'm saying is, by withdrawing from Netzarim now, it's not a huge loss for the Israelis, because, let me finish. The idea was that Palestinians would flood back into northern Gaza, right? 1.5 million Palestinians would flood back into northern Gaza. Having done so, these same Palestinians are having to move out. There's literally nowhere for them to set up home. Okay. And the Israelis are restricting aid. So you can't actually, they're trying another way to minimize the flow into northern Gaza, because they have every intention of doing what you said they would, which is basically annexing northern Gaza in the future. They're just playing this ceasefire charade. They can even play it for a few years, okay? Because if all the aid goes south and more abodes and tents and camps are set up in the south, that's where most people will end up living. Do you understand? They're just trying another strategy. So for them right now, they don't give a damn that 1 million Palestinians are going north.
It's very important again.
Yeah,
I'm not talking about the aid. I'm talking about military and for the state, for the Israelis.
right.
Because, for instance, if I am a general and I did all this just to make that Salim corridor, now, for instance, maybe Hamas, now they will be trapped in the Salim corridor. I will not go back. And I saw for them, they sacrifice a lot to build this corridor, the Israelis. If I am a military personnel or if I'm a commander, and now Netanyahu told me, go back, I will not go back.
This is what you're right. This is what the Israelis are complaining about. We sacrificed so many lives to build this. But this is, if you've seen the corridor, it's very buildable again. I don't think that's the issue. I don't think that's the biggest issue for the... I'm just... Listen, as long as there's a ceasefire, no Hamas missiles are going to come from the north of Gaza. As long as all of northern Gaza is destroyed, there's not going to be... and aid is denied, there's not going to be massive movements of Palestinians back to the north. In other words, Israel can tread water on a Gaza ceasefire of their manufacturing for a few years. until they get to where they suddenly have like a new way of destruction and getting out of the ceasefire situation. That's all I'm saying.
I think the next step here is going to be, the mercenary that, when it comes to like, is Israel going to go back into Gaza or not? I think they're going to, I think that's what Trump's also kind of coming from, right? Constelli's and what's the other one? Global Delivery Company, like these Merck companies that keep like putting in contracts to, or bids for a contract to go into Gaza. I think that's actually what we're probably going to see next before even, because I think with Trump, when he talks about owning Gaza, etc., many people consider it as like he's going to send troops, right? I don't think he's going to send troops. I think he's going to he's going to like find a way to support this Israeli plan to just have, mercenaries going to Gaza and continue the genocide. But before we end for this week, because we've already been a bit long, I know, Charmaine, that we have a feature coming out on the situation in Sudan, which is a topic we don't often discuss because, first of all, it's not within the Cradle's area of coverage. But it is very important, right? Right now, just as we are having this discussion, I'm reading that the Sudanese foreign minister from I guess what you would call the government in Sudan is also talking about that the war is almost over, right? Sudan, a country that is very strategically positioned too, just like Djibouti, which we've discussed before, and just like Somalia, which we keep going back, right? Somaliland. Sudan also in that area of East Africa, a country that has been in civil war apparently every year since its independence. So, I don't know if you want to just give us maybe a bit of a preview of what we can expect.
I mean, I urge everyone to read this article, just like our article by the same author, Aidan Simardon. It's, which last month, which focused on Somaliland and why exactly Trump was talking about recognized Somaliland all of a sudden before he even entered the White House, because there's a lot of geopolitics playing in West Asia, in Africa, but especially along the waterway routes. And if we can put up a map, Sudan's Red Sea coast is halfway between Israel and Yemen, okay? And
the Yemen issue hasn't been solved yet, right, for Israel?
The Yemen issue hasn't been solved. In fact, it's been exacerbated by Yemen's position during the Gaza war, very much so. And I think it has encouraged Israelis to prioritize Yemen for militarily in the near future. But there's more than that. The Israelis want to put a noose around Iran in every theater possible and encourage the U.S. to do so as well. For years, Iran had good relations with the government of Sudan and had access to Port Sudan on the Red Sea. You could argue maybe this was a route for Iran to conduct trade outside of sanctions. Maybe this was a route for Iran to transport weapons to the resistance axis in its resistance partners in the Gaza Strip. We don't know, the details, but relations began to deteriorate between Iran and Sudan as the Saudis started to making more inroads into Sudan, like they did with Egypt. Large amounts of cash infusions, investments, etc. And Sudan actually became one of the few countries to join the Saudi-led coalition against Yemen, in the sense that the Sudanese sent troops there. And then Sudan followed the Arab countries in 2016, cutting off relations with Iran after that ruckus over, the demonstrations outside the Saudi embassy in Tehran because the Saudis had killed a very prominent Shia cleric. But then, fast forward, Sudan's always in the news. In 2019, there were widespread protests over the, food supply, whatever, and prices in Sudan. And the military overthrew the government of Omar al-Bashir. Now there's a power struggle between two elements of the military, which is Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, okay, which is backed by Egypt, it's a northern neighbor, by Eritrea, by the Saudis, by Turkey, by Iran, and recently Russia, against the primarily UAE-backed and funded Rapid Support Forces, which is the RSF, okay? Russia used to also back the RSF. Now it backs the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF. So what's happening now is, things have shifted in the region from the Gaza war, from the situation, Yemen's sudden suddenly stepping onto the world stage as a major strategic asset for the resistance axis and willing to block waterways for international trade, right? So,
which it has stopped, by the way, right? It has stopped. Nobody's talking about that.
It will continue against Israeli shipments or Israeli destined vessels until the entire ceasefire is established in Gaza. All Israeli troops are out and Gazans have food and water and whatever, right? Yeah. So with the outbreak of Israel's genocide in Gaza, Iran was incentivized to work with Sudan. In October 2023, okay, so the month of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, the SAF normalized relations with Iran. And 2 months later, Iran began exporting weapons, specifically drones, to the SAF. And it is a year later not a year later, actually, five months later, in February 2024, these same drones helped lift the siege of Sudan's second biggest city. And so since then, thanks in part to Iranian military help, the SAF has captured the center of, this is just in the last month, in January, February, the SAF has captured the center of the capital city, Khartoum, from the RSF and other strategic cities. So all of a sudden, we're seeing a landslide of SAF victories against the UAE-backed RSF. Now, how long this continues will depend basically on the UAE, whose support is absolutely critical for the RSF. Without that, the UAE, the RSF wouldn't be standing. One of the reasons the UAE backs the RSF is because they are viewed as a potential ally against the Houthis, okay, Ansar Allah in Yemen, but really not. And so the UAE has another big financial incentive to support the RSF, which is gold. In the year before the war, the UAE imported almost $2.5 billion in gold from Sudan. And it's a figure that keeps increasing, but it's becoming costly for the UAE to continue the support, not just because the SAF is taking more territory and is increasingly able to stop weapons shipments to the RSF, but because the UAE is standing alone. Okay, even the Saudis are on the other side. And the Americans just issued sanctions against the RSF, okay? And the RSF is up for crimes committed, I think, in the ICC. So, Iran basically backed the winning horse in this debate and the UAE the losing one. Just I think something that's, I want to urge Cradle readers to read this month, because you have to see how what I called, we're already in World War III, all these little geopolitical fights are taking places in countries we don't give much attention to, but they're actually all there. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, the Iranians, the Russians, the Americans, and then even the Ukrainians and the Turks, right? So this is actually part of West Asia's various proxy wars, but important because after what we saw the Yemenis able to do in the Gaza war, all the waterways are super, super important. Nobody's taking it for granted anymore. And especially these waterways between Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Israel.
And I also think after what we saw in Syria, right, that we have learned how quickly things can change, just like overnight. So, of course, some of the topics that we're going to keep an eye on here at The Cradle. We want to thank you all for joining us today. And again, to remind you to please leave a like, to share, to subscribe, to follow us on our social media channels, and to please check out our Patreon, where you can become a supporter of The Cradle. For The Cradle News Roundup, my name is Esteban Carrillo. I have been joined by Karim Shami and Sharmeen Narwani.